My friend Mark tried to Westfalen himself because of something called the Rusted Tower. I met Mark in college a few years back. The two of us were students at the University of Tennessee. We both studied computer science, and it took a while before the two of us even started talking despite having many of our classes together. I was bright-eyed and cheerful and ready to tackle my courses that first year. Mark always hung out in the back of the room, keeping quiet, always a dour look on his face. He seemed grumpy, angry even. The other students thought he was a bit weird and I was inclined to agree. It wasn't until there was a programming project that required teamwork and cooperation that I really talked to Mark. He was a no-nonsense guy really, didn't like to joke around and was blunt in his statements. He was a genius and actually a nice guy once you knew him, but a certain sort of sadness seemed to hang over Mark's head. Like a dark cloud was constantly raining on him. There were times he would stop whatever he was doing and just hold his head as if he was in pain. I didn't know if he suffered from migraines or what his issue was, he would never say. The two of us ended up being pretty good friends throughout college. I even got Mark to go to a party with me, but that was where things got a little strange. I wanted Mark to be comfortable, to loosen up. I kept giving him drinks, trying to get him to cheer up and enjoy life for once. And for a while it seemed to be working. Mark became more social, even chatted up a few girls, but about 2 hours later Mark was on the bathroom floor, sobbing hysterically. There were people gathered around the bathroom, some with looks of concern, others with hints of laughter crossing their face. Mark sat on the floor in an almost fetal position, rocking back and forth while putting his hands over his ears and head. He muttered quietly about how he didn't want to hear the noise anymore, how it got so loud and he couldn't take it. I helped Mark up and started to take him back to his dorm, but he kept on crying. I didn't know what he was muttering about, but I got him back to his bed and had him lay down before I headed back to my own place. After that day I never tried to give him any alcohol again, never invited him to a party either. We were still friends, but I got the feeling that something was seriously wrong with Mark. Eventually the two of us graduated and I got a good job one state over. I still kept in touch with Mark through Facebook, but over the years the two of us began to drift apart, talking less and less. It was a normal day when I saw the post on Facebook. Somebody posted that Mark was in the hospital. He had attempted suicide. I would love to say that it was a huge shock to me, but it really wasn't. I felt a pang of guilt inside as I thought of how I never really helped Mark. I knew he had problems, he always seemed depressed and unhappy. I should have gotten him some help, but he was still alive I thought, so it was not too late. I decided to pay Mark a visit, maybe even pay for some therapy if he had fallen on hard times. The guy clearly needed it. I arrived at the hospital and took a deep breath as I asked the nurse where his room was. I was feeling nervous, I hadn't seen Mark in a few years now and was worried that he may not want to talk to me. I took the elevator to the 3rd floor and found his room number. I paused outside the room, feeling a little uneasy, but ultimately pushed myself through the doorway and into his room. Mark immediately looked up at me. There was a look of uncertainty in his face, like he didn't believe I'd walk through the door. He was extremely pale, gaunt, his hair long and frazzled, heavy bags under his sunken eyes. He was a shadow of the person I had known in college. He looked like crap, but I guess a suicide attempt will do that to you. His wrists were finely wrapped, his hands laying across his lap as he sat upright in the bed. I tried to be cheerful and polite, but finding the words to say to someone who had just attempted suicide was hard. "Hey Mark. I heard about what happened. I just wanted to pay you a visit, let you know that I'm here for you with whatever you need," I said. There was an awkward silence as Mark eyed me before speaking up. Maybe he didn't know what to really say to me either. It had been a few years after all. Eventually he began to speak. "Nick, hey man. Nice of you to stop by. How's life treating you?" Mark's voice was soft and withering, like he was barely hanging on to life. Life has been good for me, but I wanted to apologize to you. Maybe if I was a better friend you wouldn't have felt the need to dash. I stopped, not wanting to bring up the obvious elephant in the room. I wouldn't feel the need to kill myself. You can say it, Nick. I just want to escape it. I can't take much more of it. It's getting louder and louder each year. What's getting louder? What are you trying to escape from, Mark? I asked while pulling up a chair to sit beside him. You won't believe me if I tell you. Everyone thinks I'm just some sad sack of shit, like I want to be this way. I'll believe you, Mark. No judgment. Get it off your chest if you need to, I said. Mark took a deep breath as if to signal that this was going to be a long one and then started speaking. There comes a point in everyone's life where they realize that the universe is not all just sunshine and rainbows, that things don't always work out how they do in the movies and books. For some people it's the death of their parents that wakes them up, other people it's a betrayal in a relationship, a serious accident, or just plain failure in life. I don't know when it happens for other people, but I can tell you I realized the world was fucked when I was 8 years old. 8 years old? What happened to you? I asked, my interest piqued. Have you ever heard of the Rusted Tower? Can't say I have. It was an urban legend in my town. It was 1999 and we were just a bunch of kids doing what kids do. It was summer, so we were all enjoying our time off from school. I went outside and played with all the neighborhood kids. We rode our bikes around, traded Pokemon cards, had water balloon fights. I was normal back then. I had a good group of friends. There was one day we went to my friend Charlie's house. He had an N64 and the four of us were all excited to play Mario Party. It was me, Charlie, my friend Nate, and then Dan who rounded out our group. We were all such good friends. I had met Charlie's dad a few times before, always had a drink in his hand. Always seemed a bit sad, but overall he was nice. I guess you could label him the cool dad. He never really cared what we did. We were smack in the middle of playing Mario Party. It was that mini game where you had to skateboard while the road behind you fell. Anyways, Charlie's dad walked into the room with some iced tea and pizza for us. The four of us excitedly thanked him, and then before his dad left he asked us if we wanted to hear a story. We all agreed and sat down to listen while we sipped on our iced tea and took bites of pepperoni pizza. Charlie's dad went on a huge tale about a rusty tower that appears in the woods a few miles outside of town. He told us it appears every 33 years for one day only and that it should be appearing soon. I have no idea how he knew this. He claimed he saw the tower back in 1966 when he was still just a boy. At the time I figured he was making up stories, but he warned us that whatever we do, don't go into the tower. We asked him why not. And what's inside? But he got up and grabbed another drink from the fridge before returning to his recliner. After that Charlie was eager to find out if it was true. I was curious, but thought the whole thing was just a made-up fairy tale. I decided to ask my dad about the tower, but when I did he got a strange look on his face before telling me that there is no such thing. I took a trip to the library and found a book on local urban legends. I flipped through the book and about halfway through there was a drawing of a big rusty looking tower. I read the text and it didn't say much other than some people claim that a tower appears. It was spotted in 1900, then in 1933, then 1966, and now it was 1999. I checked the book out and showed it to my friends and this really emboldened us to find this tower. The four of us searched the woods day after day. We'd ride our bikes as far into the woods as we could looking for this magical rusted tower. Every day we came up empty and we grew a little less eager to look through the woods each time. It was a Saturday and Charlie had convinced us to give it one more try, although the rest of us just wanted to stay inside and play some games. There was a light drizzle that day, but at Charlie's behest we made our way over to the woods and began to look around together. It only took about 40 minutes before I came around a tree into a clearing, and there it was. It was a giant rusted tower, just as the book had described, just as Charlie's dad had told us. It must have been 100 feet or more tall. The tower was a patchwork of rusted red and metallic steel that gave it a foreboding appearance. There were no windows, only rusted steel. At the bottom there was a door that seemed to swing open all on its own. There was a faint sound of scraping metal that could be heard echoing from within the tower. The sight of it really unnerved me. Well, I think it unnerved all of us. We stood there in awe at the tower. Mark paused to take a sip of water. His hands were noticeably trembling as he sipped. I sat back in my chair and took a breather. It was quite a story, and I was really beginning to lean towards thinking Mark had some serious delusional thoughts, but I was here to support him and listen to him, so I simply said, "Did you guys go inside?" Mark placed his water back down on the tray next to his bed. He let out a long sigh. "Of course we did. Huge mistake, I can tell you." Charlie convinced us to go inside despite his dad's warnings. I followed behind the other three as we entered the tower. The inside was almost what you'd expect. The walls were of course the same patchwork steel with rust, but there was a constant echo of scraping, a screeching ambience like metal was being wrenched apart. It hurt my ears, but curiosity drove us forward. Or I guess drove my friends forward. I was just a follower. One of the stranger things was that it was pretty well lit in there, but not a single light bulb or light source to be seen. It was like the tower just somehow contained natural light despite the lack of windows. The walls were cold, the areas of rust rough and gritty. Weird pieces of metal jutted out of the walls. It was totally unnatural with no rhyme or reason to where it stuck out. No symmetry, no artistic beauty unless you see beauty in the chaos of randomness. They were almost like clouds that if you looked long enough you might be able to formulate a familiar shape, but these were cold metallic pieces, not fluffy clouds. There was a stairway before us that seemed inviting in a strange way. I was freaked out and wanted to get the hell out of there. I tried to convince them to turn back, but Charlie insisted we climb the stairs. Nate and Dan seemed to agree. And so up we went. A few flights up we heard the slam of the door that had previously invited us in. It had closed and my fear was that we were trapped in the tower, but my friends only seemed to glance at each other with minor confusion and concern. The stairs seemed to go on forever. We'd reach a landing and be presented with another flight. The metal sticking out of the walls made certain areas like an obstacle course we had to navigate around. It seemed like we climbed for hours. The stairways were mostly the same. Rusted red walls with bits of metal poking out at odd angles, but eventually we did reach the top and entered a large room. The ceilings were high, so high that we couldn't see them. Despite the room being lit, the light seemed to end at a point and above was simply darkness. The room seemed to almost slope at times and then not slope at all, but I couldn't tell if it was me or the room. It seemed wavy, like one side would sink and the other side would rise and then it would shift. I didn't feel any movement in the floor, but things were so unnatural there to say the least. It was at that point I really started to get scared. I was getting nauseous too, the place made me feel sick. I begged Nate and Dan to turn around with me and to go back, and they almost listened. They were scared now too. I could see it in their eyes. Charlie insisted we stay though. No boy wants to be called a coward, so we all swallowed our fear. The tower didn't feel like anything built by a human, and there was a certain sinister aura to the place that is hard to describe. In the center of the room there were 4 metal pillars that formed a square. The pillars had some strange engravings on them. I didn't know what the hell they were, a language, or drawings. All of it looked wrong. In the center of that square, there was some kind of thing in the center. Like a man made of metal, it was giant. At least 10 feet tall if it could stand, chains tied around the pillars and then around its arms and legs. I looked at it and it looked almost like a sinister version of the Tin Man from The Wizard of Oz, only it was much bigger and rusted to hell. It rested flat on the floor with its eyes closed. In addition to the chains, there were also bolts that held it to the ground. At that moment, a doctor walked into the room with a clipboard in hand. He greeted us quickly and then flipped a page up to inspect the one underneath. For a few seconds he read the page, then turned his attention to Mark, who sat feebly in the hospital bed. "How are you feeling today, Mark?" the doctor asked. "Same as usual, I guess," Mark said, his reply blunt and bordering on unfriendly. "I see. Well, I hear you are having frequent migraines and hearing noises. I am issuing you an MRI scan so we can get a closer look at your head. We want to rule out any possible tumor or abnormality in the brain. As long as we don't find anything abnormal, we are going to then turn you over to a psych who will hold you until they deem you not a risk to yourself or others." Mark grunted out a short reply, and the doctor said his goodbye and told us the nurse would be by to take him to his MRI in a short time. I turned back to Mark and he seemed eager to continue his story. I was honestly getting pretty sucked in. Even though the tale seemed bizarre, I could sense a sort of authenticity from Mark, and I could see how this event had affected him greatly. Even if it didn't really happen, I could tell that Mark truly believed it happened. "So this metal man? He didn't move? What happened next?" I asked. "He didn't move. At least at first. Charlie started prodding it, and soon Nate and Dan even joined in. I was scared, but eventually I touched the thing too. And then its eyes opened with a sickening metallic scrape sound. The four of us recoiled back in terror. I'll never forget this, but its eyes were human looking. The black pupils darted around in all directions before finally settling on us. They were horrifyingly unnatural, like they didn't belong to it. Like it had borrowed the eyes from someone and didn't know how to properly use them. They were bloodshot to hell, and as it stared at us intently, the white portion of the eye began to turn red with some kind of fluid. The metal man started struggling, trying to release itself from its bonds, while the four of us looked on in horror. I grabbed Charlie's shoulder and told him it was time to go, but Charlie, ever brave, pushed me back. Told me he thought that maybe the metal man was not so bad. That he'd be kinda like the Iron Giant from that kid's movie. But like I said before, real life ain't like the movies. The metal man strained against the chains for a minute, its eyes beginning to leak that red fluid onto his rusty body. It didn't take long and the chain snapped with a loud metal click, but the bolts still held him down. He struggled fiercely, shaking and writhing as much as its body as it could. We began to hear the strain of bolts screeching and wrenching. It was going to get loose, and the thought of it standing before me, freed and peering at me with those haunting eyes, scared the shit out of me. I screamed and ran to a corner of the room, screeching metal, and the struggling metal man filled my ears. I don't even know why I ran where I did. Terror takes over your brain at some point and you just run. Nate and Dan were right along with me, but Charlie stood his ground. I have no idea if Charlie was under some sort of effect, incredibly brave or incredibly stupid. I still debate it to this day. Mark clutched hard at the blankets around him. I could tell the story was getting to him. He was paler than ever, his face had contorted into a pained expression. For a second I thought maybe I should tell him to stop if this was traumatic for him. Clearly it was, but before I could say anything he continued. That metal man walked up to Charlie and with all the ease in the world he scooped him up in his hands. I think it was at this point Charlie knew he was in trouble, that he had fucked up. The three of us cowered in the corner, but as Charlie got scooped up, Nate looked at me with desperation in his eyes and pointed towards the stairs. I guess he was able to think somewhat rationally because Dan and I were not even close to being in our right mind. The three of us tried to go quietly towards the stairs. Charlie's horrific screams blended with the sounds of crashing metal, and almost as we turned to go down the stairs, Charlie's screams ended when the metal man pushed Charlie's head onto a metal rod that jutted from the wall with a squelch sound that I will never ever forget. Bits of brain and flesh spilled out onto the floor in front of him while his blood painted the walls behind him, but it mostly blended in with the rust. The three of us now ran down the stairs in a panicked frenzy I had never known before and have never felt again in my life. I don't ever want to feel that kind of fear again. Going down all those stairs was like a blur. We could hear the slow methodical stomps of the metal man following us down. I think at some point I even puked all over myself because my shirt was wet and had a putrid smell. But the thing that really keeps me up, the thing that made me cut my wrists just to escape it, was what happened when we tried to open that fucking door and escape. Nate and Dan led the way and the door, as I assumed, was closed. It was heavy and the three of us grunted and pulled on the large rusty handle trying to pull it open. The echoes of footsteps growing louder and closer as we pulled. It took every bit of strength the three of us had to yank that door open into what should have been our freedom, our escape from that wretched tower. But instead we were greeted by an even greater horror. It wasn't the woods we had entered at. It was something almost indescribable, a world that made little sense. A world of metal and rust that rusted and then revived and rusted again. The horrific feeling of being looked down upon washed over me. Something was out there in that world, uneven angles and hills dotted by topsy-turvy bizarre rods. Titanium triangles collapsed into iron waves. A maelstrom of what seemed to be metal that swirled and vibrated and fluxed and then took form to do it all again. Shapes and colors that scraped together and fused into metallic bits. Something massive peered at us from that world, covered in iron rods, with shifting metallic bones and rusted red eyes. It looked down at us all with absolute indifference. Nate and Dan, I don't know exactly what happened to them. I think they got sucked out into that world to become something else. We weren't supposed to see that shit, we weren't supposed to enter the tower. But the thing I can remember the most is the screeching scrape of metal from that world. It was nearly deafening. I'll never fucking forget that sound because I can still hear it. I can hear it now. I was actually feeling unnerved by Mark's story. I sat back in my chair feeling uneasy, even a little faint. A sense of dread had washed over me as he spoke about that other world. Like I was being let in on a dangerous secret, something I should have never known about. But my rational side pulled me back in. I was certainly going to look into the facts of all of this after I left the hospital. I knew the name of his hometown, and if 3 kids had gone missing then it would be a hot topic and easily found by speaking to the right people. "How did you escape?" I asked. "I don't know. The screeching became so loud that I think I passed out. When I woke up I was back in the woods where the tower was, but the tower was gone completely. The police questioned me harshly, asked where my friends were. I was only 8 years old and I tried to tell them what happened, but they told me they didn't want fairy tales. I tried to tell my parents too, but even they didn't believe me and they said I needed to tell the police the truth. Eventually I just lied to the police. Told them some creep had come and grabbed my friends and threw them in his car. They ate that up no problem. Goddamn, I didn't know what to say to that story. I certainly didn't have many words of comfort. It was so horrific, unreal, and bizarre. I expected that maybe something bad had happened, but it was difficult to process such a story that seemed to affect Mark so deeply. But Mark knew that there was not much you could say, and there was almost nothing you could do, so he spoke up again. 12 more years, Nick. Each year that sound gets louder and louder. Mark said. 12 years until what? I asked. 2032, that rusted tower will be coming back. But I don't think it will be only the tower this time. There's something else coming. Whatever I saw knows about us now. That tower, the metal man. It was all just a scout, I think. My blood ran cold as he said that. I don't know why I was feeling so lightheaded. I wiped a hand over my forehead and caught a bead of sweat. I wanted to say goodbye and leave the room, but I couldn't find a graceful way to excuse myself. Fortunately, a nurse walked in and told Mark it was time for his MRI. I helped Mark out of the bed. I felt a bit foolish, after all he wasn't old or anything. Mark shook my hand with a firm grip. I eyed the bandages on his wrist before meeting his gaze. I gave him a weak smile that was supposed to be comforting, but I probably came across as disturbed. "Thanks for coming, Nick. It was nice to see a familiar face again." I said my goodbyes and made my way out of the room as Mark walked off down the hall where he would have his MRI. I hoped the best for Mark, but my mind was racing with his story and the million questions I had. I sat down on a nearby chair and pulled out my phone. I googled Mark's hometown followed by missing children. A bunch of results popped up and I clicked on a YouTube video. I listened to the video intently as a woman went on about the facts of the disappearance, and all things seemed to point to the fact they disappeared in the woods. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand on end as I continued to look at Google search results, and they all seemed to confirm that 3 children went missing. Charlie Hoth, Nate Gladstone, and Dan Weinstein. My reading was suddenly interrupted by a piercing scream from down the hallway. A nurse ran out of the room screaming and calling for assistance. I stood up to see what was going on, and soon the MRI room was filled with emergency staff and other people who were curious as I was. It felt like hours passed with the room on lockdown. I kept trying to ask the doctors what happened, but they ignored me, told me if I had no business then I needed to clear the area. Finally I saw a male nurse who had come out of the room and offered him some extra cash to tell me what happened. He pulled me aside, his eyes shifting to see if anyone was watching, and then whispered in my ear. The guy in there who was getting an MRI, apparently his brain somehow had metal in it. I don't know how that's possible, but the magnet sucked the metal clean out of him.